Do conversations held at Davos confirm that corporations are truly now more powerful than elected governments? And is there a reason that there is one aspect of inequality that is never discussed relating to class? This conversation that I had with Joel Bakan covers all those areas in lucid detail. You may know Joel from his film The Corporation, in which he, hypothesizes that a corporation is like a psychopath. He's got a new book at the moment called The New Corporation, How Good Corporations Are Bad for Democracy. Joel Bakan's a fantastic teacher. In this conversation, he tells me about his trip to Davos and what he learned from the power players at that meeting.
The point I make is that there's been a kind of two-pronged strategy. The first prong has been over the last 40 years, big business has done everything it can to whittle down, push back, force into retreat the social state, social programs, social government. They push for privatization, they push for deregulation. So they push for a smaller and smaller capacity of the state to actually serve the needs of the people and to regulate them. So on the one hand, they've done that. On the other hand, they've said, and by the way, we're good now, so we can take over those roles that the diminished state used to run, whether it's schools or water systems or whatever. So that's been the two-pronged attack. So the shrouding themselves in goodness has been very much part of a deliberate strategy to sort of finish the work of taking over everything. And they've done a very good job at it. And I think the point when I realized it, I was shooting with a crew in Davos, Switzerland, at the big sort of Davos World Economic Forum thing in 2018. And I caught a guy named Richard Edelman in the town square, and I had my camera operator, and so we did an interview on the fly. Richard Edelman is like probably the world's most well-known and influential business guru. He's the guy that corporations pay tons of money to explain to them what's happening. And he also is a big believer that corporations should be good, should embrace purpose, should do the right thing, all that kind of stuff. And so the way he put it to me is that corporations are good actors now so they can fill the voids left by retreating governments. Now, of course, the reason governments are retreating is because corporations have pushed them into retreat. They've lobbied, they've influenced, they've done everything they can to drive down taxes, regulation, and all of that. So now that they're in retreat, corporations step in and say, okay, we'll solve the problem. They don't work anymore, so we'll take over. But then I said to him, well, what happens to democracy? Because whatever else you might say about corporations, they're not democratic institutions. And this is what he said to me, and it's a direct quote. It's in the film, it's in the book, and it's chilling. He said, because this is the good guy of corporate capitalism. He said, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I believe in the power of the marketplace. Now, that's something Maggie Thatcher would have said. But the thing is, when it's said in Davos in 2018 by Richard Edelman, it sounds really nice and fluffy and good, because now corporations are good. And so political citizenship, not really working, so just let us run things. We'll do it much better and more efficiently. And I think that is the mentality that is happening within this whole movement that talks about corporations being great, good actors now, sustainable, socially responsible, all of that.
That's really cool. I wonder how it aligns with the recent movement by neoliberals, i.e. specifically the US Democrat Party, from a kind of socially conscientious, working class oriented, wealth distribution fixated model of politics. Not that that's ever been particularly prominent in US politics, I acknowledge, towards a kind of a social justice sort of motif led, doubtlessly addressing sort of many important issues, but perhaps neglecting the kind of obligations of citizenship, or at least creation of parameters for citizenship that your man there sort of said was kind of irrelevant. It seems that there's nowhere really, there's no political party that can in good faith make a counter argument, because they've both in the case of America and all in a few other countries, but long been owned by the interests that you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the end of the book and film sort of showcase examples of politicians who try to break out of that neoliberal mode. We went over to Barcelona and talked to the mayor there, Ada Colau. We feature Bernie Sanders a little bit. We look at Shama Sawant, a socialist city councilor in Seattle. So we acknowledge that the problem is that the traditional parties of the quote left or the progressive parties, whether it's, Labor in Britain is complicated. Corbyn, may be seen as somebody trying to go in a non-neoliberal direction. But for the most part, the parties of the left in Europe, around the world, Canada, the United States, if you could ever call the Democratic Party a party of the left, have kind of abandoned their class roots. And some people say, oh, well, that's a good thing because now they're embracing broader identities and going more in the identity politics thing. And that's a good thing because those things need to be recognized. And they're absolutely right. Those things do need to be recognized. Mm-hmm. But what also needs to be recognized and what isn't being recognized is that those things are intrinsically woven into class.
Yeah.
And that, for me, the ultimate victory of neoliberalism is that it has extinguished class consciousness. It's extinguished class as an analytical tool in the academy. And it's been able, and it can do that because capital doesn't really care about gender, race. All these issues have historically been part of what's helped generate capital, is exploiting gender, exploiting race, all of that. But capital today can be quite magnanimous about equality, so long as it doesn't attack its class position.
Wow.
So if you make class invisible, you can recognize all kinds of inequalities as long as you don't recognize their intrinsic connections to class. And that's what's happened in mainstream progressive politics, is class has been evaporated. And that's why companies like Amazon or Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase can come in now as heroes and saviors and say, hey, we believe in equality. Because the term equality no longer encompasses the profound
wow
of them having the class position they have.
That's cool. I've got a few things. First off the bat, I'm sorry that I'm the person to tell you that Jeremy Corbyn has been replaced by a centrist lawyer as the leader of the Labour Party.
But there was a moment, right? And just like in the United States, even though Sanders didn't, succeed, there was a moment where you saw maybe a glimmering of a counter neoliberal kind of politics happening within a mainstream.
Yes, and in both cases, it was interesting how the sort of host party, we could call it, sort of attacked that idea vehemently, using sort of fascinating tropes to isolate, discredit, and ultimately annihilate those figures. Though sort of Bernie's been sort of posited into this sort of neutered avuncular role, it seems now, sat in his mittens as a sort of a reminder as the relentless march continues forth. I like what you said there about the magnanimity of corporations around equality that's extracted from essentially from economics, given that economics is sort of palpably and most plainly their raison d'etre and their sort of the only reason for existing. And I was wondering what you thought, Joel, about the kind of while these sort of movements around equality have been taking place, which can be bolted on to corporate and brand identities, sort of around the sort of the horrors of the murder of George Floyd and the sort of subsequent Black Lives Matter revival and explosion. The participation of corporations in that movement was notable, and I'm always myself, I suppose, because of my age and the kind of experiences I've had, sort of cynical about anything that can be if even in our country, when I see Boris Johnson and Prince Charles applauding for the NHS, I'm immediately like, well, if they're into it, I don't know how this is obviously it's not a problem. It's obviously not. It's not an attack on the on the one vulnerable point that they always put in the Death Star for narrative reasons. But like I feel like this demonization of the working class, which has sort of, I think, led to the rise of Trumpism, Brexit, even perhaps QAnon, I see now as an accompaniment to the rise of identity politics and the ability of identity politics to be bolted on to corporate agendas in a way that you can't do with people whose identities are inherently derived from class.
I mean, here's the crazy thing. Well, let me address a few points there because there are a lot of them. The first one is you are right to be cynical about the posturing. I mean, Amazon is talking about Black Lives Matter while at the same time busting unions, primarily being put together by workers who are people of color, African Americans in the United States, and other people of color in highly exploitative conditions, in conditions where they're unsafe due to the pandemic. They're trying to form unions. They're trying to say something. They're getting fired for doing that. They're working in horrendous slave-like conditions. They're having any minimal employment standards that are provided them by law evaded, avoided, squelched, lobbied against. So it is just absolutely, it's hard to be too cynical. And that's a very sad thing. But it's hard to be too cynical when corporations jump on these bandwagons or gender or any of them. And the trick is always the way that they separate the issue from class relations, from work related. They don't say, Amazon doesn't say, hey, we care about African American people, so we're going to raise the wages of our warehouse employees and stop trying to bust their unions. The day that they do that, the day that Johnson and Prince Charles say, hey, you know what? The NHS is really going to shit because it's not properly funded. So let's raise corporate taxes by 23%. Let's make sure that corporations and wealthy people provide what they should be providing so that we can have a decent healthcare system. When they do that, and when Jeff Bezos, says, hey, I want my employees to unionize, then we should have this chat again, because I may be a little bit less cynical and you may be too. But that's not going to happen.
If you're enjoying this conversation, join me over at Luminary for the rest of our discussion. And for all the latest episodes of Under the Skin, go to luminarypodcast.com to start your free trial. See you there. Thank you.